The Department of Justice under pressure after only releasing a fraction of the hundreds of thousands of its Jeffrey Epstein files by last week's legal deadline and heavily redacting hundreds of pages it did publish. Democrat Ro Khanna and Republican Thomas Massie, who championed the new law requiring these documents be released, now saying they're drafting a House resolution to hold Attorney General Pam Bondi in contempt.
They're flouting the spirit and the letter of the law. It's very troubling, the posture that they've taken. And I won't be satisfied until the survivors are satisfied.
Overnight, multiple Epstein survivors say the DOJ has violated the law and are demanding immediate congressional oversight, including hearings. Survivors like Danny Bensky pressing the DOJ for more transparency.
Okay, so the Department of Justice is in absolute crisis mode right now, and this one is massive. We're talking about a direct confrontation between Congress and Attorney General Pam Bondi that could end with one of the highest-ranking officials in the Trump administration facing contempt charges. And here's what makes this so explosive. This isn't about politics. This isn't about partisan warfare. This is about a clear legal deadline that was missed, documents that were supposed to be released to the public, and lawmakers who wrote the law now threatening to haul the Attorney General into court for refusing to follow it. This is one of those moments where you see the separation of powers actually being tested in real time. Because when Congress passes a law with a specific deadline, and the executive branch just ignores it, we're not talking about a policy disagreement anymore. We're talking about a constitutional crisis. And the fact that this involves some of the most sensitive, most politically explosive documents in recent American history makes this a powder keg that could blow up the entire relationship between the Justice Department and Capitol Hill. Now, before we get into the absolute chaos unfolding right now, let me say something. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They'll give you the surface-level headline, maybe a quote or two, and then move on to the next story. But they won't connect the dots. They won't tell you what this actually means for the balance of power, for government accountability, for whether any administration can just ignore Congress when it's inconvenient. That's why we built Politic Insane, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's really happening in Washington, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, this is your moment. Drop a comment below with your take on whether Congress should hold Bondi in contempt. We read every single comment, and your voice matters in this conversation. All right, let's get back to the video.
The Justice Department also facing heat this morning for removing more than a dozen released images, citing victims' privacy concerns. One image taken down and later restored, featuring President Trump, the DOJ saying it later determined no Epstein survivors were in the photo. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche telling our Pierre Thomas more files will be released soon, and insisting there is no effort to protect the president.
President Trump has certainly said from the beginning that he expects all files that can be released to be released, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Documents released on Friday's deadline include never-before-seen images investigators obtained searching Epstein's possessions, including several showing Trump's political opponents, like photos of former President Bill Clinton and Epstein together. But no Epstein survivor has ever accused Clinton of wrongdoing. A Clinton spokesperson writing, "This is about shielding the White House from what comes next, or what they'll try and hide forever."
In a series of interviews with Vanity Fair, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles said President Trump, who had a decades-long friendship with Epstein before they had a falling out in the mid-2000s, does come up in the DOJ's total Epstein files, but not, quote, doing anything awful. The Department of Justice says more files will be released in the coming days and weeks.
So many details in the story, and Jay, you've been following it all along. Thank you so much.
But when you pass a law with a clear deadline, and that deadline is ignored, you're not dealing with executive privilege or classified information debates anymore. You're dealing with defiance. And the members of Congress who championed this law are now making it very clear. If the Attorney General thinks she can just blow past a statutory requirement, she's about to find out that contempt of Congress is not a theoretical concept. Now, let's talk about who we're dealing with here. Pam Bondi is not some low-level appointee. She's the Attorney General of the United States, one of the most powerful positions in the federal government. She runs the Department of Justice, which means she controls federal prosecutions, oversees the FBI, and is supposed to be the nation's chief law enforcement officer. And she was handpicked by Donald Trump specifically because of her loyalty, her willingness to take on controversial fights, and her track record of defending Trump in his first impeachment trial. So when Bondi makes a decision to withhold documents that Congress has legally demanded, this isn't just some bureaucratic delay. This is a calculated move, and it's a move that suggests the administration believes it can simply ignore legislative mandates when it suits them. The lawmakers behind this transparency push are not backing down. They've already gone public with their frustration, and now they're taking the next step, threatening formal contempt proceedings. And here's what that means in practical terms. If Congress votes to hold the Attorney General in contempt, it triggers a legal process that could result in criminal referrals, civil enforcement actions, and a courtroom battle that would dominate headlines for months. It would put Pam Bondi in the same category as other officials who've been held in contempt. People like Eric Holder, Steve Bannon, and others who've defied congressional subpoenas. And it would create a massive political spectacle, right as the administration is trying to push through its agenda on immigration, the economy, and foreign policy. But here's the thing that makes this different from past contempt fights. This isn't about a subpoena that Congress issued in the heat of an investigation. This is about a law that Congress passed, that the president signed, and that carries the full weight of statutory authority. When you ignore a subpoena, you can argue about executive privilege. You can negotiate over what gets produced. You can fight it out in court. But when you ignore a law with a hard deadline, you're in much shakier legal territory. Because the law doesn't say, provide documents if convenient. It says provide them by this date, period. And the courts have consistently held that when Congress exercises its legislative power to mandate disclosure, the executive branch doesn't get to just opt out. So here's where this starts to get really complicated. Because this isn't just about transparency and government accountability. This is about what kind of precedent gets set for future administrations. If Pam Bondi can blow past a statutory deadline and face no real consequences, what's to stop future attorneys general from doing the same thing? What's to stop any cabinet official from deciding that congressional mandates are optional? And more broadly, what does it say about the balance of power if the legislative branch can't enforce its own laws against the executive branch? Let's break down what this actually means, because this situation has layers that go way beyond just one missed deadline. First, understand that Congress has very limited tools to enforce its will against the executive branch. It can pass laws, but it needs the executive to implement them. It can hold hearings, but it needs cooperation to get witnesses and documents. And it can threaten contempt, but actually enforcing contempt against a sitting cabinet official is incredibly difficult. The Justice Department, which Bondi controls, is the entity that would normally prosecute contempt referrals. So you've got this circular problem where Congress is trying to hold the head of the Justice Department in contempt, and the Justice Department is supposed to prosecute itself. It doesn't work. Which means Congress would have to go the civil route, filing a lawsuit in federal court, and asking a judge to compel production of the documents. And that process can take years. Second, there's the political dimension. Pam Bondi is not some independent arbiter. She's a Trump loyalist, and she was installed specifically to be a firewall for the administration. So when she refuses to release these files, the question everyone in Washington is asking is, what's in those documents that the White House doesn't want the public to see? Is it information about Trump's connections to Epstein? Is it details about other powerful people who were involved? Is it evidence of failures by previous administrations to properly investigate and prosecute? Nobody knows, because the documents haven't been released. But the very act of withholding them creates massive suspicion, and it feeds into the narrative that this administration has something to hide. Third, this is happening at a time when Trump's relationship with Congress is already strained. Republicans control both the House and the Senate, but Trump's approval ratings within his own party have been slipping. There are Republican lawmakers who are frustrated with the chaos, the constant scandals, the inability to get major legislation passed. And now you've got a situation where even some Republicans are starting to say, wait a minute. We passed this law for a reason, and if the administration is just going to ignore it, what does that say about our role as a co-equal branch of government? So this could become one of those rare moments where you see bipartisan frustration with executive overreach, and that's dangerous for any White House. Fourth, let's talk about the international implications, because believe it or not, this has them. One of the ongoing themes in the Epstein case has been the involvement of foreign nationals, foreign intelligence services, and international financial networks. The files that Congress is demanding could contain information about foreign governments, about intelligence operations, about money laundering schemes that cross borders. And if the U.S. government is seen as covering up that information, it damages American credibility on the world stage. It makes it harder to lecture other countries about transparency and rule of law when we can't even enforce our own disclosure laws. Allies are watching this, adversaries are watching this, and it all feeds into the perception that American institutions are breaking down. Fifth, and this is the part that affects everyday people, this is about trust in government. We're living in a time when public trust in institutions is at an all-time low. People don't trust politicians, they don't trust the media, they don't trust law enforcement, they don't trust the courts. And when you have a situation where Congress passes a law demanding transparency, and the executive branch just refuses to comply, it reinforces the worst suspicions people have about how the system works. It tells people that the rules don't apply to the powerful, that accountability is a joke, and that no matter how much you vote or how much you demand change, the people at the top are going to do whatever they want. And that kind of cynicism is corrosive. It undermines democratic norms, it fuels extremism, and it makes it that much harder to have any kind of rational debate about policy. Now, here's where things could go in the next few weeks. Congress has several options. They can hold hearings and drag Pam Bondi in front of committees to explain why the documents weren't released. They can vote to hold her in contempt, which would be a symbolic blow and would trigger the civil enforcement process. They can threaten to withhold funding from the Justice Department until the documents are produced. Though that's a nuclear option that would shut down prosecutions and law enforcement operations across the country. Or they can file a lawsuit in federal court asking a judge to order the release of the documents, which would take the fight out of the political arena and into the legal system. Each of these paths has risks and benefits. Hearings would generate headlines and put pressure on Bondi, but she could just stonewall and refuse to answer questions. A contempt vote would be dramatic, but without criminal prosecution, it's mostly symbolic. Withholding funding would hurt the administration, but it would also hurt federal law enforcement at a time when crime and immigration are top political issues. And a lawsuit could take years to resolve, by which point the documents might be irrelevant or the political landscape might have completely shifted. But here's what's almost certain to happen. This is going to become a major story. The media is going to cover it extensively, not because of the specific details of the Epstein case, but because it's a direct confrontation between two branches of government over the rule of law. Legal analysts are going to weigh in on whether Congress has the authority to enforce its own statutes. Constitutional scholars are going to debate the limits of executive privilege, and the public is going to be watching to see whether anyone in Washington actually faces consequences for defying the law. There's also the question of what this means for the Trump administration's broader legal strategy. Because if Bondi can get away with ignoring a congressional mandate here, it sets a precedent for how the administration handles other oversight requests. We're already seeing fights over documents related to the January 6th investigation, over financial records, over communications with foreign governments. And if the administration believes it can just run out the clock and ignore deadlines without facing real consequences, it's going to embolden them to stonewall on everything, which means Congress is going to have to decide whether it's willing to actually use its most powerful tools, or whether it's just going to issue strongly worded letters and then move on to the next crisis. And let's be honest about the political calculus here. For Republicans in Congress, going after Pam Bondi means going after a Trump appointee, which could bring down the wrath of the MAGA base. But if they don't go after her, they look weak. They look like they're abandoning their own legislation, and they lose credibility with voters who care about transparency and accountability. For Democrats, this is an easy call politically. They're going to hammer Bondi and Trump on this, but they also know that without Republican support, they don't have the votes to actually enforce contempt. So both sides are stuck in this position where they want to look tough, but neither side wants to be the one responsible for triggering a full-blown constitutional crisis. Meanwhile, the American people are left wondering what's in those files. And that's the ultimate irony here. Congress passed this law specifically because there was public demand for transparency, because people wanted to know the full story, because there were too many unanswered questions about how someone like Epstein was able to operate for so long with apparent impunity. And now, instead of getting answers, we're getting a fight over whether the government even has to follow its own laws. It's exactly the kind of thing that makes people lose faith in the system. So here's the bottom line. This is not just another Washington turf war. This is a test of whether Congress has any real power to hold the executive branch accountable. It's a test of whether laws mean anything when they're inconvenient for the administration. And it's a test of whether transparency and government accountability are real principles, or just talking points that get abandoned the moment they become politically uncomfortable. Pam Bondi missed a legal deadline, and lawmakers are threatening contempt. The question now is whether they're actually going to follow through, or whether this is going to be another example of tough talk followed by nothing. And if Congress blinks, if they let this slide, the message is clear. Statutory deadlines are optional. Executive branch officials can ignore legislative mandates with no consequences, and the separation of powers is more of a suggestion than a real constraint on presidential authority. That's a dangerous precedent, and it's one that would outlast this administration and empower future presidents to behave the same way. Keep your eyes on this, because what happens in the next few weeks is going to tell us a lot about whether American democracy still has the ability to enforce its own rules, or whether we've reached the point where the only rule that matters is political power. This story is far from over, and the implications reach far beyond just one set of documents. This is about the future of congressional oversight, the limits of executive power, and whether anyone in Washington is still willing to stand up and say that the law applies to everyone, even the Attorney General of the United States.